When considering a new build in Path of Exile, there's always one archetype lingering in the back of my mind: triggerbots with brand recall. Triggerbots come from the Saboteur Ascendancy Perfect Crime. It's a passive that creates two little bots that trigger your spells from their position, each of them trigger doubling the amount of triggers that you can make. Brand Recall calls all of your active brands to your location and then activates them each one time. If you trigger Brand Recall and you have a maximum of 7 brands, the brands teleport to the bot's location and are all activated 2 times for 14 activations. However, if you use Arcanist Brand, which is a brand that triggers another linked spell, each activation of that brand is doubled by trigger bots. If you then combine Arcanist Brand with trigger bots and have a triggered cast of Brand Recall, then you have an example of something you're typically not able to do in Path of Exile: a trigger creating another trigger. If you do this with trigger bots, then at each step the triggers are doubled, multiplying them not by 2 but by 4. For 28 casts. The convenience of the brand playstyle combined with the sheer amount of casts that you can get out of this combination make it a very attractive option on paper. However, this archetype has some serious drawbacks. For one, Arcanist Brand has an inherent and very costly downside. Any spell triggered by Arcanist Brand does around 60% less damage if the target is not attached by an active brand. This wouldn't be so bad, only activations of a brand through the use of Brand Recall can never be considered attached for the purposes of damage. This means that the only activations that you will get that will deal full damage will be from the typical activations of Arcanist Brand when it is on an enemy and activating. Unfortunately, the 28 cast combo will always have this around 60% less damage multiplier as a downside. Another obvious large drawback is that you need a large mana pool. This is for the obvious reason that trigger bots is multiplying your mana usage by somewhere around 4 when brands are recalled. All of this mana is used at one moment, meaning you simply need a big enough mana pool to cast 28 activations. Because it is likely that the cost is close to the character's entire mana pool, very high mana regen would be required. The typical way players get around this problem is by using Eldritch Battery, which uses your energy shield for mana. Then energy shield is stacked high enough, such that energy shield recharge and some amount of energy shield leech would be enough to sustain all casting. A non-SSF friendly way to solve this would be to just use a Watcher's Eye. You can get a Watcher's Eye while affected by Discipline to have a flat amount of energy shield gained on hit. Combined with Eldritch Battery, essentially it will give you infinite mana so long as your spell is hitting enough times relative to the mana cost. The common spell that is used in this setup is Eye of Winter, a spiral that shoots out many projectiles in all directions. The projectiles gain damage for the closer they are to dissipating, so right before the projectile reaches its max length, it would deal the most damage. One of the main reasons for using Eye of Winter is actually because of an intended downside with Arcanist Brand. Arcanist Brand has a limited maximum range. This is relevant for the property that allows projectiles to return to the caster. Normally, it is almost impossible to get Eye of Winter projectiles to return fully to the caster, as the projectiles will dissipate before reaching a maximum range, at which they will return. Arcanist Brand caps the range and makes this far easier to achieve, allowing for the many projectiles from Eye of Winter to be all focused in one area. This build essentially is a series of perfectly interlocking combinations that make a few spells far more effective than they would otherwise be. One unfortunate consequence of this Eye of Winter setup is that it simply makes too many projectiles in some cases. So many that the game can often lag or even crash if you attempt to pass all of those projectiles through too many enemies at the same time. For me, this build is close to unplayable because of this. So I wanted to come up with a way to use this archetype without using Eye of Winter, so I don't lag out, and a different way of approaching mana and defenses so that I could go Trickster with CI, which is busy using Energy Shield as its life pool, so we can't go Eldritch Battery anymore. I came up with this idea while attempting to make a horrible wardless loop character, a character that damages itself and has over 100% damage taken recouped as life, such that it can have an incredible amount of sustain and can cast a constant barrage of cast when damage taken triggers. To solve for the incredibly high mana cost, the build uses damage taken recouped as mana to functionally have instant mana recovery, perfect for the brand recall archetype, though I wanted to go CI Trickster, which only has energy shield, and typical recoup only works for life. This reminded me of an item I've never used but I've always been curious about, the Graven's Secret Unique Belt. This belt turns your power charges into absorption charges. Each absorption charge grants 12% elemental damage taken recouped as energy shield, so any amount over 8 is greater than 100% recoup for elemental damage taken. So that solves at least the self-damage and converts it into regeneration essentially. This only works with elemental damage though. The only reasonable way I could find to deal elemental self-damage was with the Eye of Innocence, which deals 100 fire damage when you ignite an enemy. This lines up with stacking power/absorption charges, as fire skills always ignite when hitting with a crit. Power charges obviously make getting 100% crit chance far easier. It seems as though if you're willing to use alternate charges, you might as well use Rallycash. The Rallykash's Impatience boots allow you to have maximum of all of your charges while being able to make use of the absorption charges from the belt. As it turns out, these boots are actually a pair of nice crutches that make any build relatively functional. So with this pair of crutches and 10 absorption charges and power charges, not to mention the other ones, the build is far easier to crit cap and therefore does not need ignite chance. If using a fire skill that hits a lot of times as to trigger the Eye of Innocence self-damage, it should solve my energy shield recovery, making me effectively immortal to anything but one-shots. And if the self-damage is enough relative to the mana cost, it should also solve my mana through the use of damage taken recouped as mana. The self-damage obviously enables cast when damage taken setups, which in this case are just free value, extra spells that will automatically cast while you're running around. My initial thought was Blazing Salvo, which can shoot 8 projectiles that overlap and all hit the same enemy. If I link this with Greater Multiple Projectile, it will shoot 12. Then if I have Return Projectile, it could possibly hit one target 24 times. That is somewhat unlikely given how the skill works, but that would be 24 times 28 if every projectile hit off of the brand recall trigger for 672 hits. In this case, pre-mitigated, Eye of Innocence would deal 67,200 fire damage to you. If you are res capped at 75%, it would be 16,800. With 120% of that damage recouped as energy shield, this should be more than enough sustain. And with damage taken recouped as mana, this should be enough self-damage to solve mana. The only problem is that if too many of the projectiles hit at once while the recoup is not yet active, say at the beginning of a map or when you haven't been fighting recently, 16,000 fire damage all at once could easily one-shot you. To solve for this, I will once again be using the Watcher's Eye that grants flat energy shield on hit, granting even more ridiculous amounts of recovery. The next problem to solve is that Blazing Salvo lacks the innate damage scaling Eye of Winter has, and I'm using GMP for 26% less projectile damage, returning projectiles which do 61% less damage, and Arcanist brand for 63% less damage with hits against the non-branded enemies. This setup currently hits a lot of times and does a ton of self-damage, but doesn't really do much damage to the enemy. One common way to get better damage is to use curses, which got me thinking. I'm already using power charge stacking. Why not use Anathema, which makes your curse limit equal to the maximum power charge limit? So if I have 10 power charges, I have a curse limit of 10. 10 curses would normally be really annoying to cast on everything, so I could actually use the cast when damage taken setups to automatically trigger all of those curses. When taking all of the self-inflicted fire damage, now everything has pretty much every curse in the game applied to it. This is a very nice value proposition, which reminds me, Deodre's Scorn is a unique helmet that grants 37 to 71 chaos damage per curse on an enemy, for an average of 540 flat chaos damage if the enemy is cursed 10 times. This combined with Shimmeron, which generally scales well with power charges, and the build actually is doing some pretty good damage. Now, all elemental damage is recouped at 120%, so essentially if an elemental hit doesn't kill me, it will actually heal me. This is a Chaos Inoculation build, so it's simply immune to Chaos damage. This leaves the only vulnerability of the build as physical damage, which can be solved by a few physical damage taken as mods, and generally having a high hit pool. Some problems I'm still working on is, well, to get better gear and better gems for higher damage. In my POB with an ideal setup, the brand recall hitting all projectiles would do something like 40 million damage. My setup is nowhere near that. One limiting factor keeping this character from higher damage is the constraint of the maximum mana pool. I'm only reserving 2 auras, 1 discipline, and a level 1 clarity for the Watcher's Eye, making a max mana pool of 1224 currently. With the mana reduction ring and inspiration support, the build cannot afford the 28 activations at once without all of these considerations. The problem is exacerbated by all of the max level curses triggering, costing a ton of mana, and actually triggering twice and triggering more than necessary as I take more and more damage. Originally I used Sublime Vision for Discipline, which granted another maximum power charge, but the curses required more mana recoup to cast, which I could only reasonably get enough from the Watcher's Eye mod. Currently I'm capping my res with a flask, which is sort of lame. I could craft a better ring, but eventually I would want to switch to Nimbus. And there's another problem with that. The final and most important problem of the build is, oh, I forgot the number of projectiles. Yeah, so apparently Blazing Salvo is even worse than Eye of Winter was, and that was the entire purpose of the build, was to change spells to avoid lagging and then change the defensive layers. This is a 10-minute-ish clip of me doing one incursion. So yeah, you can skip around if you want. But essentially, here it is. This is what we got. After all of this theory crafting and all of the good things about the build, and it could have gotten way better too with gear, but it essentially doesn't matter unless you somehow mod the game to turn off all effects or something. Sick.